Hello, and thanks for inviting me to talk to the Darwin Club for Social Science. Um, Today, I'll be talking about my work applying generalized Darwinism to the life sciences industry, pharmaceuticals, medical technology, and most of what I'm going to say today can be found in my book, Darwin's Medicine. So this is my agenda for today. First of all, I'm going to try and set your expectations and talk a little bit about the premises and the goals for my work and the background to the research that I did. But the bulk of what I'm going to talk about today will be my findings. What I found out about the industry's selection pressures, what I found out about speciation of business models within the pharmaceutical and medical technology industries, and the parallels that illuminates with evolutionary biology. Um, but finally, I'm going to close on implications for practice because that is the bulk of what I do. So my work is somewhat different from many of the people in Darwin's Club. It's very definitely applied. It's what Stokes called in Pasteur's quadrant, in the sense of its um, uses fundamental concepts to practical use, or similar to what Gibbons called mode two work. Because my primary aim is to improve practice, I borrow theory and apply it rather than build fundamental theories. There are lots of people in the Darwin's Club who do the theory building job much better than I do. I came to the generalized Darwin field via a circuitous route. I'm originally a research chemist, I'm a physical scientist to start with, but I've always been a fan of other branches of sciences, in particular of Charles Darwin. But people like Dan Dennett and Richard Dawkins led me to understand evolution in a more scientific way. Um, but my work in applying it to business strategy and business models in the pharmaceutical industry um, was triggered by Nelson and Winter, as I'm sure you'd expect, but it was steered very heavily by um, the book Darwin's Conjecture that we're all familiar with, and this book, This View of Life. I'm particularly interested in these concepts of ontological communality and multi-level selection. I tell you all of that to set your expectations because I don't really want you to judge me today, the members of the club to judge me today by the normal standards of academic research. Um, that would be judging a fish by how well he climbs a tree. I'm really trying to do something a little bit related, but different from what most of my academic colleagues do. So with that said, let me press on. The basic premise for my work is that the global life sciences industry is very important, both socially and economically. I like to say that it's the most important industry in the world. Um, but its environment, both its sociological and technological environments, are changing quite fundamentally, and the industry is adapting to that. And I think it would be useful, both economically and socially, to understand what's going on. Yeah. And that's what I've written about in my book, Darwin's Medicine, but it's also the spine of most of my other books, the other 7 books I've written, including the newest, New Drugs, Fair Prices, which is coming out later this year. In terms of methodology, I come from a pragmatist epistemology. My work tends to be mostly inductive, although veering sometimes towards the abductive. And I take a mixed methods approach, as you'd expect with that epistemology. Um, I have carried out many dozens of interviews now in the industry. I also, a large bulk of my work comes from looking through the thousands and thousands of pieces of industry news that cross my desk about mergers and acquisitions and new product launches and product failures and product successes and so on, that I sort try and make sense out of. I do a lot of secondary content analysis too, and some of my work is informed by the advisory experience I have working with pharmaceutical and medical technology companies to help them devise and implement their business model changes. I like to flatter myself that, in essence, this is the kind of methodology that Darwin adopted when he wandered round the fens outside Cambridge as an undergraduate, collecting beetles and sticking them to boards. But that probably is self-flattery. So on to the findings. I'm going to present 3 major findings today. And the first one is this the idea that there are profound distal changes in the industry's environment that are changing the selection pressures on the industry. And that these can be understood as something I call the six great shifts. So let me explain this diagram a little, because this and the next five diagrams are the same format, and they're trying to convey similar ideas in different contexts. So if you look at the box on the left here, the grey box, demographics, healthcare, inflation, and so on, these are things that are happening in the external environment. And they and other things combine together in the manner of a complex adaptive system to shift the nature of the environment. And in this case, we say it's shifting. What is shifting is the way that value is defined and by whom it is defined. So formerly in the industry, so in the industry I entered some decades ago, the value of a pharmaceutical or a medical technology was defined in terms of its clinical outcome. And that value was defined by healthcare professionals, usually the doctors that prescribe the medicine. But those changes you see on the left have shifted the environment from being the left, the red box, to the black box. Value today is defined as clinical value, yes, but also economic and other outcomes too. And it's defined not just by the prescribers, but by a whole load of healthcare professionals and the people who pay for the interventions, and the patients, or sometimes their proxies like insurers. What that means is, these boxes on the right, is that it is now the environment now disfavors companies or business models that can only understand clinical value as defined by healthcare professionals, and only to understand value creation in terms of products. And the environment now favors firms that understand multidimensional value as it is perceived by the customer, and value that is created in a context-specific way. Well, that sounds a little abstract, and hopefully it'll become clearer later. But the point is that things have happened in the environment which have changed the way that value is defined and by whom, and that has caused a change in the selection pressures in what is a successful business model and what is not a successful business model. The second of the six great shifts is I call the global shift. So these things on the left, international trade, multinational corporations, and so on, have shifted the world from a world where demand is mostly in developed economies, and it's and in as much as it is heterogeneous, it is heterogeneous based on clinical requirements. So most of the market was in Western Europe and the States and a few other countries like Japan. But now both demand and supply are global, and they are heterogeneous, not just along the needs of what the patient needs clinically, but also in terms of things like how much people are prepared to pay and how they want to pay, and patients' other higher needs, such as compliance and comorbidities and so on. The point of this shift is that it changes the selection pressure away from favouring business models that can only define value narrowly according to clinical categories, and it favours business models that understand this market heterogeneity and deliver broad value across segments that are spread across the globe. So, for instance, I often say that what companies need to do now is to understand that a rich patient in Boston has more in common with a rich patient in Shanghai than they have with a poor patient in Boston. The third of the six great shifts we're seeing is the holobiont shift, caused by these things on the left. But it shifts the world from a world where the organizations that competed were predominantly vertically integrated organizations with predominant centers, well-defined boundaries and scope of organizations. And what competes now are polycentric networks that are fluid and ill-defined networks of organizations. I call it holobiont because that's a biological term for an organism that is made of multiple organisms, like a coral reef is a holobiont. Human beings are holobionts because a large part of our function is attributed to our microbiome. And again, this is an example of the environment changing and shifting what the environment favors in terms of business models and what it disfavors. The fourth of these six shifts is the systemic shift. This is a shift in the science of pharmaceutical somatic technology. These things on the left have caused this shift in how we define and understand illness and wellness. So healthcare used to be reactive, based on treating populations, and it used to be hierarchical in how it made sense of illness. Now it's proactive, it's personalized, and it's participatory. Um, what that means is that business models succeed now if they understand how systems medicine works. So, for example, a business model succeed if it treats cancer according to the genomics of the tumor rather than the old Ostlerian method of saying it's a lung cancer or liver cancer. The next shift is the information shift, a shift in the way that information is used. These things on the left have changed the world away from where information was used on a small scale, fragmented basis. And now it's used on a much larger scale, pervasive, inductive basis. Again, it changes the selection pressure of what a trait a business model has to have. And the last of these is the trimorphic shift. Because of the changes on the left, it used to be that organizations used to be relatively competent across the entire length of the value chain and used to try and compete against the entire length of the value chain, from new product development to supply chain management to customer relationship management, and increasingly polarized into a kind of isosceles triangle where the most effective organizations are merely adequate at two of those three things and would have to be excellent at one of those three things. The point I'm trying to get across, and obviously I talk about these in much greater length in the book, is that these 6 shifts create 6 changes in selection pressures, which act all at the same time, but unevenly, and they operate at different levels. Some of them operate at the levels of routines, some of them operate at the levels of companies, some of them operate at the level of holobions. But the point is that it changes the selection pressures acting on business models. Now, in biology, of course, we know that when you change selection pressures, you get speciation or changes in the species. So what I would expect to see, using it from a generalized Darwinism perspective, is something like radiative speciation that we see in biology. And indeed, we do see that. So this is a slide I like to use with the executives that I talk to about it, taking Stan Metcalf's famous quote, and explaining how we know that biology works, how evolution works in biology, of variation, selection, replication, and saying what is exactly the same thing is happening in the industry. The point I'm making here is that what is happening in our industry is not like Darwinian evolution, it is Darwinian evolution. It's just that the replicators and the interactors are different from in the two different environments. And in biology, evolutionary choices, I know they're not really choices, but metaphorically choices, are driven by the need to optimize reproductive success, whereas in the industry, evolutionary choices are driven by the need to optimize risk-adjusted return on investment. So the biological parallels would lead me to expect to see something like we see in biology. And this is a famous diagram, which I'm sure you've seen versions of, about how radiative adaptation has led to the 8.6 million species that exist on Earth today. So I was wondering whether I'd see something like this in the pharmaceutical industry, and it turns out that you do. First of all, you see a very fundamental speciation along which type of the value chain organisations compete with, and this, of course, is not a new observation. This is just what Porter saw in his generic strategies in his book, his 1980 book. But then we see pharmaceutical companies making choices to whether they're going to compete with their technology, with the NPD part of, with in selling to government buyers, or whether they're going to sell to individuals, institutional buyers versus individuals. And each of those things have different risk and return profiles. And then we see them making choices as to whether to be, if we take just one part of that speciation I showed you, the technological innovators in the government pay habitat, we see them making choices between being a discontinuous innovator on the one hand or an incremental innovator on the other hand. And then they make decisions about whether they're going to innovate with a single technology or whether they're going to integrate multiple technologies. They have different risk and return profiles. Then they make decisions about whether they're going to try and compete in large markets or small markets. A large market offers larger returns, but generally has more competitive risk. A small market has less competitive risk, but smaller returns. And in this part of the habitat, for instance, I identified 8 different business models, each of them representing different choices. And these are just examples of them. If you're familiar with the industry, you'll be familiar with what these companies do. Taking a step back and looking at all of that radiative speciation in the industry, I identify no less than 26 different business models, each of these representing a different set of risk and return choices, speciating in a directly parallel way to biological evolution. I also like to show that same data in a fitness landscape, and where each of one of these peaks represents one of those 26 business models that we saw. And the reason I find it useful to present it in this way is a reminder that we see fitness troughs like you get in biology. So you might find a pharmaceutical company that has invented a fabulously effective and successful product, a fabulously successful and expensive product, which is successful, or a moderately effective but low cost product, and that is successful, but the company that chooses to produce a product that is of middling effectiveness but middling cost falls into the fitness trough. Because some customers want the really good expensive product, some customers want the cheap, moderately effective product, and nobody wants the middle cost product. And there are lots of other examples of fitness troughs that I observed in the research. The third finding I want to talk about is the parallels that I'm discovering between biology and business. We're all familiar with the modern synthesis in biology that has allowed us to understand biology better and is enabling life sciences technology in what I do. But there is a parallel monosynthesis, I believe, emerging in business evolution that will allow us to understand the omics, if you like, that enable management practice. So I'm sure you're all familiar with something equivalent to this. I do this myself, but it's derived from lots of other people's work. We know that we get species with particular characteristics. They're defined by their particular anatomy, physiology, behavior, and so on, the phenotype. We know that that phenotype is driven by their proteome. Proteome is characteristic of a species, okay? And there are different types of proteins, and we know that those proteins are expressed by genes, and we know that those genes are determined by base pair sequences. Just, biology 101. What I see in my work is a direct parallel. So the traits of a business model, the shared traits of a business model, a business model is a set of organizations with the same traits, in the same way that a species is a collection of animals with similar traits. We know that the phenotype of an organization, the organizational traits, include things like its strategy, its structure, and its culture, and so on. And we know that those are expressed by, they are the result of its capabilities, or what I call its full set of capabilities. I call it its capabilium. Okay? And its capabilities could be functional and regulatory, and they determine the form and viability of the organization in the same way that the protein determines the form and viability of an organism. We know that those, and I suggest in my work that those capabilities are expressed by routines, that an organization's complex set of thousands of routines, which I call as routinome. Okay? And some of those routines are shared with other species of organization, other business models. Some are unique to a business model. And my work suggests that those routines are underpinned and the result of the micro foundations. And I'll talk a little bit about those in a second. The point I'm trying to draw here is that there are very close parallels that we can use to help us understand business evolution and indeed how to manage businesses. won't talk at great length about microfoundations because I'd be going on all day about this, but I identify 4 categories of microfoundations that seem to be responsible for the functioning of routines. The attributes of individuals within groups, um, the dynamics between individuals within groups, the way the groups are connected, team interconnectivity, and the methods that are used to align and deconflict the work of groups. And because of my biological bent, I gave these the acronym of ACTG because I wanted to be reminiscent of the base pair sequence in biology. So that's my agenda. And I covered it, I hope, at the right level of depth, but obviously there's much, much more in my writing. The last thing I want to cover are the implications for practice. I think that this work supports management in 4 or 5 ways. The first is that I think my work allows organizations and the leaders of organizations to understand how their selection pressures are changing, the selection pressures that are acting on their existing business models. I think it also helps them to identify their options for their future business models. It also helps them to select which of those business models might be most viable for them in their current environment or their future environment. It helps them in the design of those future business models because it helps them design the capability and the routine they need. And it helps them to navigate and avoid the fitness trough between business models because there are indeed in the process of business model transformation, there is a fitness trough between your old business model and your new business model. In essence, what I think my work does is it allows firms to manage deliberately the changes to their proteome, their routinome, and microfoundations, or in other words, their capabilium and routinome and microfoundations to enable the genetic engineering of their business models rather than letting them evolve at random, which is an expensive and wasteful process. I hope that was useful. Um, as with any presentation, I always feel like I could talk forever about this, but I'm conscious of your time. If it was useful and you weren't able to make the presentation, then I would be delighted to hear from you with any questions or comments you have. And if you'd like to read some magazine articles that are précis of my book, Darwin's Medicine, then let me know and I will gladly send them to you. Thanks for your attention.